saw this little video from Dan McClellan. Now, I haven't spent a whole lot of time with Dan McClellan. He is, as far as I can tell, is still a member of the LDS Church. McClellan is a part of the, well, I've talked before how there was very clearly a decision made to try to mainstream Mormonism. And so instead of just having the best and the brightest just study at BYU and just get degrees from BYU, they started sending their graduates out to Ivy League schools, big name schools, get degrees that would be really impressive to the world. The problem is, once you took your best and your brightest and got them out of the Intermountain West and sent them off to these places, they're going to encounter critical theory, not critical theory as what we're talking about today with critical race theory and stuff like that, but they're going to be taught to analyze religious texts, hopefully with some kind of consistency in the context in which they were originally produced. And the problem with this, and I've seen this happening a lot, this is one of the major things causing changes within Mormonism today, is they come back to Utah, they start teaching at BYU or wherever else, and they bring this critical methodology with them. And here's the problem. None of the LDS scriptures can even begin to survive critical analysis. If you're doing text critical analysis of the New Testament, at least you're dealing with an ancient document. You're not even dealing with an ancient document, the Book of Mormon. That's the problem that Mormonism is facing right now, is by sending these guys out, then bring them back in, they injected directly into the bloodstream of Mormonism an absolute poison. If you're going to have these people coming in and applying critical methodology and stuff like that. So it really doesn't work well. So, but let's get it started here, and we'll comment on what goes down.
All right, let's see it.
Okay, so here's what Dan McClellan, active member of the LDS Church, degrees from outside of Mormonism in various fields of, especially expressions of divine names and images. So here's what it says. Me explaining that out of 7,957 New Testament verses, only 40 can't be resolved with textual criticism compared to 25,000 ancient manuscripts, making its accuracy 99.5%. Okay, let's start off. That is a muddled mess. All due respect to whatever kind believer was trying to make a point here, but that's not even English sense, let alone a real good representation. Me explaining that out of 7,957 New Testament verses, okay, only 40 can't be resolved with textual criticism. Now, what does that even mean? What are you saying? 40 verses? 40 verses? Variants are rarely just a verse. And what do you mean can't be resolved? Are you saying that we can't know what the original reading was? That the original reading has been lost? So I don't know where this is coming from, but I wouldn't even agree with that. And can't be resolved with textual criticism. You mean by means of analysis of manuscripts, analysis of the kinds of variants that arise from the copying of manuscripts, errors of hearing, homoteleuton, all, are we talking about, is that what we're talking about? I would assume so, but most of the time people who do textual criticism would not use this type of language. Can't be resolved with textual criticism. And then compared to 25,000 ancient manuscripts, making its accuracy 99.5%, makes absolutely, positively no sense at all. You're mixing all sorts of different categories here. But this is comparing examples of a variant in a verse with how many manuscripts you have and coming up with an accuracy number. Sorry, that's just not how to do it. Let me show you before we get to McClellan here how things have improved over the years. And this is Mark, University of Munster. This is Mark chapter 14, verse 62. We'll blow it up here in a second. This is called CBGM, Coherent Space Genealogical Methodology, and it's available. So, for example, this is Mark chapter 14, verse 62, variant number 9. So you put the numbers are, the words are even numbers, the spaces are odd numbers. So you'll notice there's a little mark right here where there is a variant. And so it will give you an apparatus. So Mark 14:62 is in Jesus's trial. Jesus said to them, I am, and you will see the Son of Man, see it at the right hand of power and coming upon the clouds of heaven. So this is where Jesus takes Psalm 110 and Daniel 7 and conflates them in reference to himself, identifying himself as the Son of Man, divine figure. This is why the chief priest tears his robes and says, you've heard the blasphemy, etc., etc. So, claim, and by the way, I just want to make sure, Dan McClellan's not making this claim. He's going to be responding to this claim. I just don't even know where it's coming from. Clearly, whoever did this doesn't know anything about CBGM, doesn't know anything about how you actually do textual criticism. And so, look, I'll be the first one to say, there's a book came out. I don't think I have it in here right now, but Myths and Mistakes in Textual Criticism or something along those lines, I think is what it's called, came out, I don't know, 5 years ago now. So let's just start on this and we'll continue with it, because he's responding to a poorly framed argument. All right.
So there are 4 statements of fact in this image. One is uncontroversially true. One is close to being true, but is also wildly misleading. The other 2 are pure fabrication. The uncontroversially true statement is that there are 7,957 verses in the New Testament. The kind of true statement that is also wildly misleading is that there are 25,000 ancient manuscripts of the New Testament.
Okay. These numbers change regularly, mainly because of ongoing efforts in cataloging. When it comes to the Greek New Testament manuscripts, that number between 5,600 and 5,800 keeps changing, especially thanks to CSNTM, and they're studying and they're doing high-quality digital photography of manuscripts around the world. And when they do that, they discover, this manuscript actually isn't a separate manuscript, the same manuscript as that one, but part of it's here, part of it's there. Or they discovered their manuscripts that you open it up and discover that the last half is a different manuscript than the first half. So that would double the number there. The other thing would have the number there. The number keeps changing. And then the largest body of manuscripts you have are Latin manuscripts, obviously, copied in the West. And then, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic, Sahidic, Bohairic, all these other manuscripts that, again, up until the last century, no one had any idea of these numbers. There was no way to get the university over there and the university over there to even use the same nomenclature to identify manuscripts with the same catalog number or name or whatever. It was a real problem when the first critical texts they're trying to produce first critical texts that utilized at least some portion of the available information out there. Yeah, how many total? Really hard to say. You could, he's saying here it's actually a little over 27,000. Again, it depends on how you are counting manuscripts. That's why you can only give round numbers to be at all fair in looking at this type of stuff.
It's actually a little over 27,000, but this counts all manuscripts in all languages from our earliest manuscript all the way down to the printing press.
In fact, a little past the printing press in some instances. So when you look at the Comma Johanneum, 1 John 5:7, some of the manuscripts that will be cited there are still handwritten manuscripts that were produced after the invention of the printing press. Sometimes over 100 years after the invention of the printing press. Because just because you invented the printing press doesn't mean that there are a bunch of them running around. And for a long time, manuscript production continued to be by hand. So the point he's going to make, and it's a very valid point and needs to be understood as a valid point, and I have tried over the years to warn people. Remember how I warned people? Well, okay, maybe you don't. Maybe you're one of those folks that's new. Back when I debated Bart Ehrman in 2009, during the audience questions, a kind, I'm sure very well-meaning, elderly Christian gentleman stands up. He was going to do the Isaiah scroll argument. And the Isaiah scroll argument is a good argument if it's used properly. And that is, it is true that up until the discovery of the Isaiah scroll at Qumran, that the earliest manuscript we had at that time of Isaiah was from 900 years after Christ. The Isaiah scroll is from 100 years before Christ. So 1,000 years passed by. And when we look at the Isaiah scroll, there has been no changes. The Masoretic text type of the manuscripts we had from 900 years after Christ, identical. Now, that tells you properly that there does not of necessity have to be textual corruption in the promulgation, the copying of ancient manuscripts. So those are realities that have to be dealt with and recognized. So the Isaiah scroll argument is a good argument, but it only says so much. And when people try to make it say more than that, so when the guy presented it to Bart Ehrman, I sat back, I knew what he was going to say, and I could have said it for him. But he says, but that's very true. However, Jeremiah in the Greek said, and the poor guy had no idea how to respond to that because he had probably never heard of it before. So where we get into trouble is when we get into these conversations, we start making these claims, and we haven't read deeply enough in the whole field to recognize I can only go so far with this particular claim before I'm standing out on a limb and I'm starting to hear creaking and cracking behind me. And I need to be careful. Okay?
Around 1500 CE. And the overwhelming majority of those manuscripts come in the second half of that window. So come in the medieval period after 1000 CE.
Yeah, that's true. Though and this is going to be part of the important part here, in comparison to any other work of antiquity, the reality is that the earlier testimony from the New Testament is better than any other work of antiquity. We have to be really careful about that. There are other works of antiquity that have broad manuscript testimony, Homer especially. But as far as getting close to the original, I don't think there's anything that can even come close to the New Testament. But yes, the bulk, when we talk about 5,000, let's say big number, 5,800 Greek manuscripts, vast majority of those are after 1,000. But the number of papyri that we have, the number of early uncials that we have, that have vast portions of the New Testament, no other work of antiquity comes close to that. Really doesn't.
And most of them are in Latin as well. They're being
Yeah, I rarely think about adding that in specifically. Normally, when I refer to the numbers of manuscripts we have, I'm limiting that primarily to original language manuscripts, according to Greek. And so he's thinking 27,000. I'm not really thinking along those lines.
Transmitted during the medieval period. When we look at Greek manuscripts, we have a little over 5,800 Greek manuscripts. And again, the overwhelming majority of them come in the latter half of that window. Here's a chart showing the century which our earliest Greek New Testament manuscripts come from.
Now, it's interesting. I didn't get any feeling in listening to, and this is a short video. I didn't get the feeling that this is his area, or that he's familiar with CBGM or the ECM, at least as far as functionally. Because you'll notice it says he has here Alexandrian, Egyptian, eclectic, Western, and Byzantine. I mean, there's a majority of folks have already pretty much totally abandoned the idea that there is such a thing as the Western text at all. The only text type that CBGM has actually verified so far is the Byzantine. The use of text type language, and if you read my King James only book, it's all through it. It's all we had at the time. I wrote that long before CBGM came along. All that's changing, and that's a good thing, by the way. What we're talking about is the most in-depth analysis of the New Testament manuscripts that has ever been done. There has never been a time before when we could have done. That's a good thing. That's a proper thing. Stop it.
And also the textual tradition to which they belong. So the dark maroon in the back, the Byzantine tradition, is where the overwhelming majority come from, and they come from after 800 CE, and that is also the tradition that has the most variation from what is generally considered to be the most reliable tradition.
Sort of. Again, CBGM, when you look, and the nice thing in the printed editions, I'm sure it's online too, but the printed editions, the number of changes have been very small, which would indicate we have been doing a decent job beforehand. But taken as a group, there is more of a movement, there is a correction, and there is more of a movement toward the Byzantine rather than away from the Byzantine. Now, there are a few examples going the other way, but in general, like Manuscript 33 has vaulted in its importance. It's seen to be an extremely reliable manuscript with high coherence with important witnesses and things like that. I get what he's saying, but again, it doesn't sound like he's familiar with what's happening with CBGM or hasn't worked the modules or done stuff like that, which very few people have. I'm not faulting him for that. I'm just simply saying that's something that I hear when I'm listening to what he's saying.
In the first 300 years of the transmission of the New Testament, we have maybe 124 manuscripts.
That's interesting because that's the number that Dan Wallace uses. But that's a fairly safe number, and it's an amazing number. Why is it an amazing number? It's an amazing number because of the fact that we're talking about a corpus of texts produced by a minority religion that was hated by the most powerful governmental entity known at the time in the world. And we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that governmental entity known as the Roman Empire sought to not only destroy the religion, but to destroy the documents of the religion. So the fact that we have what we have, given the nature of papyrus and the fact that, in places like Italy, that's not a place that's highly conducive for paper documents to survive for 2,000 years. having 124 manuscripts in the first 3 centuries, I do not believe there is any other work of antiquity that comes even close to that. Even close to that. And the nice thing about that is that they are not coming from just one spot. They're coming from multiple spots, which is what you want. Because that one place can be controlled, but when it comes from multiple sources, you can't control the multiple sources. So the 124 manuscripts is a good thing. So let's pick up pretty much where we were with what he has to say.
Of the New Testament, we have maybe 124 manuscripts.
Okay, so that's in the first 300 years. And it would be good if he would say, and in comparison to pretty much any other work of antiquity, that's far more. We have far earlier attestation, and that's not even questionable. Unfortunately, a lot of times people don't really give you that in the whole rest of it.
Maybe 3 of them contain the entire New Testament, and those all come at the very end of that window. Our earliest manuscript of any kind dates to about 125 CE, contains like 36 or 37 words of the tens of thousands of words in the New
Testament. Okay, now that one bothered me. What he just said was the earliest goes to about 125, and I know what he's talking about. And he says it only contains like 37, 38 words out of all the words in the New Testament. And I'm like, bruh. Okay, like I said, I don't get a feeling he's familiar with CBGM, and I don't care if you call yourself a Bible scholar. I can tell when somebody doesn't do text criticism, but has read, has had to read about some of it, but doesn't actually do it. Because here is, there it is. Here's what he's talking about. And we've looked at this before, and those of you who've seen my debate with Bart Ehrman know that I was wearing a tie that featured these images during that particular debate. And this is manuscript P52, and it is very small. It's about the size of a credit card. You're seeing both sides of it. And you can sort of tell this was up toward the top of the page. In my presentation on the reliability of the New Testament, I wrap the rest of the text around this so you can see how it would have looked. But yeah, there are very few words there. Does that lessen the value of the manuscript? Well, it depends on what you want the manuscript to be doing. If we want a full manuscript of the Gospel of John from AD 125, then yeah. But why is this so important? And why can a small fragment like this be so vitally important that we should be quite excited about it? Well, the answer is given in the reality that what you have here, it is from John. John is the earliest attested of the Gospels as far as its manuscript tradition is concerned. And it's not that it's from John chapter 18, 31 to 34 on one side, 37 38 on the back side, which is fascinating because that's Jesus' conversation with Pilate. No, the issue is this. This demonstrates that the Gospel of John, in the form we have it today, inclusive of the 18th chapter and its interaction of Jesus with the Romans and all the important stuff that goes with that, was already in circulation and being copied in the first quarter of the 2nd century. And when you recognize the all-out effort on the part of the Roman Empire to destroy the New Testament, to destroy the Christian scriptures, you look at this little piece of papyrus, and if you lived in the year 125 and you were making a copy of the Gospel of John, and you're sitting there having a conversation with somebody else, and this one guy goes, "Hey, I just had a thought. I wonder, what's the chance that the papyrus you're writing on right now could last for 2,000 years?" And you're just trying to do an accurate copy of what you're copying. You don't even want to get into this, but what would be the chance of all the copies of the Gospel of John? So what would the chance be that this little fragment would end up in the basement in London, having been brought from Egypt when the British stole everything from Egypt. And so what is the value of something like this? You know, well, I just got 37, 38 words. That's not the point. The point is it testifies to the existence of the Gospel of John as the Gospel of John we know today in the first part of the 2nd century. And no other work of antiquity comes even close to this. So we go back to our video.
New Testament. So we can't even cobble together a full New Testament until that earliest full copy of the New Testament.
And again, why would anyone expect that we should be able to? What we should, if you understand history, if you understand manuscript tradition, if you recognize that contemporary documents to the New Testament average, that the first extant manuscript we have averages 500 to 900 years after the original was written, then why would we expect to have anything more than that? Why even present it this way? This is the agnostic way of expressing things. And this, again, is why I just sit back and I go, you believe in this? Book of Mormon Doctrine and Covenants program is called the Triple. You're speaking like this about the New Testament. You have to know the massive problems. It's one thing, okay, Doctrine and Covenants, that doesn't claim to be an ancient document, so all right. But the Book of Mormon, the textual changes in the Book of Mormon since it was first printed, we have more data because it's a modern production about the printing and production of the Book of Mormon than we could ever have of something from 2,000 years ago. And you apply similar standards there, and you're just going to go, whoa, pure redaction, changing, editing, whatever, change words. And then you get into the Book of Abraham? I mean, really? The chasm here just leaves me going, I don't get it. Maybe he just doesn't even believe they're ancient documents. So why would you expect to have full copies of the New Testament? Do you have any idea how much that would cost to produce? I've seen a lot of discussion. But the patristic sources demonstrate that the vast majority of the New Testament is functioning as scripture before we have manuscripts that have survived long enough to give us that physical testimony. So the patristic citations of the entirety of the New Testament long predate the physical manuscripts that have survived all the way down through the centuries.
In the mid to late 4th century CE. Additionally, we don't know what was going on in the textual transmission of these texts between their composition and our earliest textual witness to them.
Now, here's the thing, and he says he's going to get into this later in the video, which is important. This is one of the most important aspects, in my perspective, of what we've been trying to do for years and years in preparing Christians to give a defense for the inspiration of Scripture and for the function of Scripture. Some of you will remember that and I began a PhD program, and the reason I did so down there was because my Dr. Vater did his PhD under Metzger, and my initial project that was approved was to look into this exact issue, because every work of antiquity has what's called a black hole. That is, unless you possess the original manuscripts of a document, then there is a time period between when the document was originally written and the first extant copy, which, as I mentioned, our first manuscripts, on average, are between 500 and 900 years later. So that's the black hole. That's the period of time where you do not have physical manuscripts documenting what the transmission process is about. So we just looked at P52. If you take the later date of John, that a lot of people would have, 98-ish, then that's within 25 years of the original writing. If you put it before AD 70, it's still within 55 years of the original writing. in comparison to any other work of antiquity. Nothing comes even close. You would think that would be something that would be emphasized, or, wow, it's just really amazing that this New Testament is very, very different than it. No, you've got people who are trying to raise doubts in people's minds, not really honestly deal with the facts as they stand. And so my thesis project was to use P45. And my initial thinking was, in studying P45, I saw that P45 is very unusual. We have portions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. It's the only early manuscript we have that has all five, and probably in the Western order initially. And fragmentary, obviously, that's the largest chunk. That's the largest page that we have, and of course that's blown up. A lot of like the Markan stuff is just very small. But the point is, studies of P45 had demonstrated that each of the book has a different textual character. And what I mean by textual character is all of scholarship, and most scholarship still speaks this way, but the consensus is breaking down, would utilize, and Dan McClellan used this too, of text types: Alexandrian, Western, Caesarean in some contexts, Byzantine especially. And you had differences in one manuscript, which meant that the author of that manuscript had access to different exemplars that had a different textual background to them. And this is around the year 200 to 220. What I wanted to do was to use that as the foundation to try to shine a light into that period where we don't have documentation. And as I've mentioned in the past, it didn't take much time starting on that project to encounter CBGM and the major impact CBGM analysis and technology that would have to be taken into consideration. And that had to change the nature of where we were going. But that's the idea, is yes, there is we don't know what was happening. Well, sort of. If we only had a small number of manuscripts, then yeah, major revisions and changes and redaction could be taking place. But when you have a large number of manuscripts coming from different places, this is the difference between the phone game idea of a single line of transmission, where if you mess things up back here, there's no fixing it later on. If you have multiple sources, multiple lines of transmission to multiple audiences, that fundamentally changes what this argumentation is all about. And that's why I've emphasized this type of material for a long, long time in the presentations that we've done. But there's just such a massive chasm between discussing how P45 can be relevant to casting light into that dark period prior to our first manuscripts of other books. I mean, Mark is one of the later ones attested. Revelation especially. The point is, Revelation has the wildest, craziest textual tradition of any book in the New Testament. But the point is, we can do this even with the most textually challenged of the books of the New Testament. You can't do anything with the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, in the LDS scriptures. They're not in the same realm. They're not historical. They are modern. 1830 is modern. Let's do a little bit more.
And that is a black hole for textual criticism. We just don't know, and we're going to come back to that. Now, the two statements of fact that are just pure fabrication. One is the 99.5% accuracy claim. This is a number that was literally just made up. Norman Geisler, in a couple of different publications, claimed that the textual critic Bruce Metzger estimated the New Testament to be 99.5% textually accurate. Bruce Metzger never made any such statement whatsoever. Norman Geisler just made it up. And
now, I don't know. I've seen stuff like this, obviously, a number of times, and you'll you'll have these big, great names of textual scholars in the past, and they're going to estimate 1.5% or 2.5%, and you put all this stuff together, and that's where you come up with it. I don't know, but I just want to remind you as we play this that on the last program, what did we do? We pulled up CBGM. We pulled up the modules online and showed you how for individual verses, chapters, books, you can now, using the CBGM databases and the interfaces that are available, you can demonstrate the consistency of the manuscript testimony to these works. And you can find out, is it 96.7%? Is it, because if I recall correctly, on average, I think the Byzantine is like 87 that identifies that. But once you actually start looking at specific wording, it's much higher than that, because that's looking at all the variants put together. So it's much higher than that. And the CBGM databases demonstrate it. It's not an estimate anymore. Because when Geisler's writing his stuff, General Introduction to the Bible, that kind of computer technology did not exist. And there was no human being, no matter how much time they had spent, Metzger or anybody else, with the manuscripts, that could possibly remember enough variants and remember, minor variants, because now the computer can look at all the minor stuff and put all that in there to be able to come up with numbers like that. You couldn't do it. So it was always a guesstimate. But now with CBGM, it's a computerized documentation of the most extensive collation of New Testament manuscripts that's ever been done. That's the day we live in. It's a great day.
Attributed it to Metzger. And when he was called on this, he said, well, it doesn't matter. Look at all these other figures. They have estimated that maybe 1 in 20 variants is meaningful. Maybe 1 in 60 variants is meaningful. Maybe 1 in 1,000 variants is meaningful. And so he took a bunch of guesstimates by scholars who were just riffing on how many textual variants are meaningful, and he cobbled all these guesstimates together and said they average out to about 99.5% accuracy. So,
okay, now the problem here is, yes, Norm struggled with a few things. He's the one that misidentified how you even identify variants and how many there actually are. It wasn't his field. Neither was Reformed theology his field either, as some of us demonstrated and documented. But even there, in criticizing this, I sense confusion, because when I lecture on this stuff, and I do this with lay people, so I need to make sure they're following and understanding what it is I'm saying. I explain the difference between viable and meaningful. And I'm not hearing that distinction being made here. Meaningful means that it impacts the translation and hence the meaning of the text. Viable, which would be the better term here, refers to the possibility that this variant could represent the original, because there are variants in the New Testament that are not viable. I'll give you a good example. It's the one that we have focused upon in dealing with the TR folks. And the TR is all the Book of Mormon had, by the way. Just mention that in passing. Well, it didn't even have the TR. It had the English translation of the TR. Again, the anachronism is obvious. But Ephesians 3:9. Ephesians 3:9 in the TR comes from a 12th, at the earliest 12th, 13th century manuscript, where oikonomia versus koinonia, we've gone through all this before, look it up in my responses to Jeff Riddle and stuff like that. That's not a viable variant. There is no evidence of its existence in any translation, Latin, Greek, Coptic, Sahidic, Bohairic, whatever. There is no evidence of its existence prior to that Greek manuscript. There's no patristic sources that demonstrate it. And so it's not viable. So if you have a single manuscript from the 13th century that with no evidence before it that its reading ever existed, that's not a viable reading. So viable and meaningful are not the same thing. Because that variant is meaningful, it changes the meaning of Ephesians 3:9, but it's not viable. So again, that's where I get this feeling that this isn't his area. He's done reading in some of it, but not a whole lot of actual hands-on work.
This is a made-up number that was then validated by averaging guesstimates from New Testament textual critics. So that number is simply false. And then the 40 verses that can't be resolved with textual criticism claim, that is just looking at 7,957 verses and saying, what is 0.5% of 7,957? Oh, 40 verses? Okay, that must be how many verses cannot be resolved with.
Yeah, and like I said, that did not make a lick of sense to me, what the original claim was about. And without examples of that, it is bogus. Because variants are not verses. There may be a few verses that have multiple variants that are both viable and meaningful, but there are very few variants that are an entire verse. The vast majority of variants are one word, word order, forms of words, stuff like that. So, yeah, that part, as we said last time, didn't make a lick of sense and is completely bogus.
Textual criticism. Now, I want to return to the biggest problem here. The elephant in the room is that black hole between the composition of these texts and our earliest textual witnesses. Because when scholars talk about textual criticism and how sure we can be and how few verses are unsure, they're talking about based on the manuscripts that we have. Here are the readings that are unsure. And those readings are the readings that are found in the existing manuscripts. Because many textual critics think you should not do any conjectural emendations.
It should be spelled an E if you're looking it up. It's not emendations, it's emendations.
In other words, you should only propose a reading if we have a manuscript that contains that reading.
And I would be one of those people. I don't see any reason for conjectural emendation. We've talked about this before. I've responded to people. I know I've responded to TR only guys that point to one or two instances of conjectural emendation in modern Greek texts, which are clearly documented right there, which I reject as well. Don't see any reason for them at all. But that element of things, he's saying, some say you should never have to. We don't have to because of the depth and breadth and quality of the New Testament manuscript tradition that we possess.
And this is an enormous assumption. This is assuming that every single word that was written in the original autographs of the New Testament is somewhere preserved across the thousands of different manuscripts.
Yes, this is called, and you might want to listen to the cross-examination with Bart Ehrman, the tenacity of the text. This is a term used by Kurteland and discussed in his work, where he argues that the New Testament text is tenacious. That is, that all readings, even silly readings, that have appeared in the New Testament textual tradition continue in that textual tradition. So that may sound really negative to people at first, because that means mistakes continue to be copied. But what that also means is the original words continue to be copied. And that's what's vitally important. And I think that's really one thing that CBGM is providing evidence of. I'm not going to say proving, but providing evidence of. And why do I say that? What we've seen in Mark, Acts, and the general epistles is that listing of changes is extremely small. And it is not in any way saying, oh, we've got entire holes here. Now, there's like one place in 1st, 2nd Peter someplace that people go, oh, see, here's, we're talking serious amounts of text here. And the idea that the skeptic is trying to present is that you could have original readings that in that really short period of time disappear, leaving no evidence, no trace. Now, again, if you had a single line transmission, then I could see how that could happen. We don't have a single line transmission. We have multiple authors writing it multiple times to multiple audiences. There was no group that had control of New Testament manuscripts. They were spread all over the known world. So the idea that you could have readings that just simply disappeared does not make any sense. When the New Testament does begin to appear in P52, P4, P32, P46, P75, P72, P66, all these early papyri manuscripts, it is the text we possess today. Very few variants came to our notice only because of the discovery of the papyri. We already knew about the variants from later manuscripts, which again testifies to the tenacity of the text over time. And I just have to say, once again, none of this is even slightly relevant to any of the Mormon scriptures. Outside of, we could do an analysis of the textual changes of the Book of Mormon in English as it's been printed and then edited by the LDS Church all the way up to the modern period. White and Delightsome, Pure and Delightsome, stuff like that. But we know why that is. Okay? So we can't do well, we could. You could technically do CBGM on the English translation from 1830 onward. But that's only going to tell you who's doing the editing. That's all that's going to do. You can't do any of this from a historical perspective because these are not historical books. The Book of Abraham is the fevered fantasy of Joseph Smith's brain. It was not written by Abraham. It's an Egyptian funerary document. Okay, so we could do CBGM on Egyptian funerary documents. Okay, so if we wanted to come up with a really accurate version of the Book of the Dead or the Book of Breathings in the Book of the Dead, that is actually something you could do given the number of manuscripts we have. The only problem being that those documents were not meant to be necessarily accurately transmitted. They could be edited given the context in which they were being used at a particular point in time. That changes everything. CBGM is based upon the idea that the scribes are actually trying to transmit the same text from one manuscript to another, which they were. That's what they were doing. But it just strikes me once again how strange it is to be dealing with this. I want to finish listening to, he was responding to an admittedly very poorly stated Christian argument about 99.5% accuracy on the New Testament manuscripts. I couldn't even figure out where the Christian presentation was going. It was comparing apples and oranges. It just wasn't well done. So it was an easy one for McClellan to go after, to be honest with you. But this raises the question of what he calls the black hole, which is the fact that for any work of antiquity where you do not have the original writing itself, which until very modern times means everything. I mean, we don't have the originals of the Quran or anything like that. I mean, that's just how things work when you're talking about history, that the period of time between when it's written and our first manuscript evidence he calls a black hole. I don't know if that's the best terminology to use, but yes, there will always be a time period between our first manuscripts and when something was written, because it has to be being copied during that time and distributed, and the vast majority of everything that was written, unless it was chiseled in stone, the vast majority of everything that was written in the first century doesn't exist anymore. Or in the century before that, you keep going backwards and the percentage gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That's why when they you're always finding stuff in Israel, because archaeological work is going on constantly. But they had found some of the blessings and cursings, and I think it was primarily cursings, from, Deuteronomy 28, 29? I think it was actually chiseled on rock in Paleo-Hebrew. From what? 700-800 years before Christ, something along those lines? And everybody gets all excited, and we're like, but that's only a couple verses. That's only, yeah, but the point is, almost nothing that's written in the ancient world is going to survive through to today, unless it's chiseled on rock. And the New Testament wasn't chiseled on rock. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be something that was a message that goes out to the whole world. As I said last time, other works of antiquity written contemporaneously with the New Testament average a black hole, a time period between when they were written and our first extant existing copies. So half a millennium to almost a full millennium before we have our first copies. And so he had said we have about 124 manuscripts of the New Testament books in the first 300 years, which means the New Testament is attested far earlier than any other work of antiquity. Apples and oranges again. The New Testament's actually a historical document. The Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham are not historical documents at all. They're fake, frauds. They're not what their authors said they were. And yet this man belongs to a church that continues to hold them out as the Word of God. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but there you go. All right, so that's where we were. Let's dive back into it, or we're never going to get this done.
Now, I want to return to the biggest problem here. The elephant in the room is that black hole between the composition of these texts and our earliest textual witnesses. Because when scholars talk about textual criticism and how sure we can be and how few verses are unsure, they're talking about based on the manuscripts that we have.
Let me just point out, people trained in textual criticism do not talk about verses. Now, maybe he's doing that just because the video that he was tearing apart used some reference to verses. But when you're talking about variants, you talk about variants. There can be multiple variants within a single verse. There are verses without variants. So I don't get it. But what he's saying is, when you talk about relative statements, and we mentioned in previous programs, we don't have to do the ask a bunch of textual scholars, average their answers thing anymore. We have CBGM. It's not just a matter, he's saying that this is all based upon the manuscripts that we have, which is the broadest, earliest, and most accurate manuscript tradition for any work of antiquity. Period. End of question. You cannot argue that. All right, so we continue on.
Here are the readings that are unsure. And those readings are the readings that are found in the existing manuscripts. Because many textual critics think you should not do any conjectural emendation.
That should be EMENDATIONS, conjectural emendations. And as I said last time, yes, I would be one of those to say I do not see any reason for conjectural emendation, which is where you propose as the original reading a reading that does not have any basis in the manuscript tradition. For the vast majority of other works of antiquity, with the exception of Homer, especially Plato, Pliny, Suetonius, stuff like that, you at times have to use conjectural emendation because you do not have sufficient manuscripts to have a high enough level of confidence. So when you encounter a major variant that just doesn't make any sense, then they'll go with the conjectural emendation. It seems like what he was saying was this, and that would make more sense, and that kind of thing. I don't see any reason to do that in the New Testament. We have sufficient and early enough attestation to not have to do that.
In other words, you should only propose a reading if we have a manuscript that contains that reading.
Right.
And this is an enormous assumption. This is assuming that every single word that was written in the original autographs of the New Testament is somewhere preserved across the thousands of different manuscripts.
Which was the position of Kurt Aland. And he discussed that many, many years ago, this concept of tenacity. And while Bart Ehrman may scoff at it, he didn't provide much in the way of refutation. In fact, in our debate, when I asked him, okay, so show us where we don't have the original words, he again pointed the same, that there's only one reference that they'll refer to in Peter, Enoch. It does not impact anything theologically or anything like that. And that's all he could give us. Because the fact of the matter is, I suppose someone that really wanted to put some work into it might be able to come up with maybe 5 places where you could at least try to make an argument that, it just doesn't seem like any of our manuscripts have the original reading here. But you'd really be pushing it to do that. And that's probably like 5 words out of 138,000 in the New Testament, which would be better than 99.5% accuracy, by the way. Just thought I'd mention that in passing. But so he needs to recognize, McClellan needs to recognize, that if you're going to deny tenacity, then you're the one making the assumption. You're the one making the assumption that the most broadly and earliest attested manuscript tradition of any work of antiquity is not tenacious and would be liable to lose original reading. That's the assumption he's making.
That was composed by a New Testament author writing an original manuscript that was lost in that black hole between the original composition of the text and our earliest textual witness.
So again, every work of antiquity has a time period between the original composition and their first manuscript copies. And what he's saying is stuff might have been lost. And hey, as a Mormon, he has to believe that. In fact, he should say many plain and precious truths have been removed from the Bible. But he knows he can't back that up. And he knows many plain and precious words have been moved around in the Book of Mormon too. So there you go. That sort of causes a bit of a problem.
That is a dogma. There are no data that support that. In fact, I would argue that the data argue directly against that, because the further we go back in time in our manuscripts, the more likely a given verse is to have a variant.
Okay, what he's talking about there is the assertion, and there have been studies on it, but I've not seen. Royce comes as close as you can in his magisterial work on the New Testament papyri. But even he would come to the conclusion that the idea is once you get into a period of establishment of the Christian faith, no longer under persecution from the Roman Empire, that's 313 AD, and then especially you start getting, after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, you get the monasteries and the monks copying manuscripts and things like that, that you get a standardization of the text. That's somewhat true, and it's standardization especially of a certain form of the Latin text. The Greek text became less and less important over time in the West until the Reformation. But the idea is, well, the papyri, all these wild variations, that's not really the case. Though, if you are to look at the differences between them, you are looking at manuscripts that are being copied during a time period where they very well could be being copied in a place that was illegal to possess them, which means you don't get to have professional scribes doing that. That's why Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, they pop up after the Peace of the Church in 313, where you can actually have professional scribes be doing the work now. You look at, I've always used P72 as an example. The author of P72, have you ever heard the theory that if when you're writing in handwriting or printing cursive, I know no one reads cursive anymore, that if the line goes up, if it's not a lined piece of paper, if the lines tend to go up, that means you're happy. If the lines tend to go down, you're sad. And so P72, which is our earliest handwritten copy of 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude, the scribe must have been happy because the lines go up, the early manuscripts. So let's see if we can we will be able to at least finish this one up.
Ability in our earliest manuscripts than in our later manuscripts, because as these manuscripts circulate more widely and as people are comparing them, they start to harmonize them, they start to standardize a textual tradition.
Well, I would just point out that if you're specifically going to talk about harmonization and standardization, that creates variance. That creates variance where you take a reading from here and take a reading from there and put them together and expand it. So that actually creates variance. It's not, and that's not what we see in the papyri. Royce's study demonstrated that, and now with CBGM, we'll be able to, I think, do more work in that specific area. I don't know of anybody that is yet, especially because we don't have the entire New Testament to compare things with.
So there is a big assumption among more conservative textual critics that black hole has no differences in it.
No differences. No, what Kurt Ahland, I think, demonstrates very clearly is it's not that there are no differences. It's that the original readings remain tenacious and are transmitted through the multiple lines of transmission. If that were not the case, if there was major textual disruption, then what we would have is we would have manuscripts with wild variation, entire stories not found anyplace else. We looked at P52. We might find a manuscript with a whole different story of what Jesus says to Pilate in John chapter 18. Never happened. We've never found anything like that. The closest thing you can get, and it's really not from the dark period at all, is Beze Cantabrigiensis, Codex D, which I call the Living Bible of the early church, where the scribe was just willing to just make stuff up as he went along. He tells us how many stairs Peter descended to get to the street after the angel freed him from prison. Okay, but the very fact that we can recognize that scribe was doing weird stuff demonstrates the tenacity and the consistency of the rest of the scribes that weren't making stuff up and editing things and taking stuff out and everything else. So I would say that McClellan needs to be able to demonstrate, needs to be able to give more than just agnosticism. And he might find himself in the exact same position that Bart Ehrman found himself in. Well, where don't we have the original? Well, is it Enoch or one little place over here someplace? You would think that there would be hundreds of examples. There aren't. It's not there.
And that assumption is wildly irresponsible.
And that's where it just ended. Wildly irresponsible. No, it's not. Dr. Dan McClellan. It flows from actually studying textual criticism on a level that I don't think you have. I'll just be honest with that. I just don't think you have.